Welcome back to the 266th episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to flip through some of the top stories, including how China is eating our lunch on the mineral war when it comes to EVs. We have heard about it. Now we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive. Then, how Biden can actually survive without the youth vote and what demographics need to go his way, and then an interesting approach to saying our condolences for the Iran president. So, and of course, we will end today with our daily delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive, ready to take on the day. Now that's enough rambling from me. Let's jump in to our daily debate. So, when it comes to this new economic war that we are in with China, and they are eating our lunch so bad, they have all the minerals for all these green technologies that we absolutely love. The question becomes, should we temper our push to be a more EV reliant nation, a more clean energy, green energy reliant nation when all of the technology to do so is coming from one of our geostrategic enemies? It's a serious question. It's one that we're not actually going to take up. And what I mean by that is we're not going to actually start cutting back on our green production. We're just going to start outsourcing to other places in order to actually get some of those resources. And we're going to try to build up our own domestic infrastructure, which is one approach for sure, but we're not quite there yet. So the question becomes, do we keep pursuing it and keep giving China money in the process, or do we scale back for a little bit while we grow that infrastructure, we grow that production, and then when we're ready to fully jump into the new age, the new green revolution, do we do it then? Tell me your opinions on that one, because I think it's something that we have to have this discussion about, because to pretend as though we can just keep on going as is and it be politically, geopolitically advantageous for us, you're leaving me pretty skeptical if you're giving me that perspective. But hey, I want to hear other people's perspectives. So let's jump into our first article that comes from the Wall Street Journal. China is winning the minerals war. And I've talked about this for quite some time, actually. It's the going trend that China has been building up its infrastructure for years upon years in lots of different areas, whether that be in microchip production, whether that be increasing the amount of coal plants that they have. They have been on this train, so to speak, and they've been really being on the forefront, trying to make sure that any emerging market they are at least a participant in, that they have the infrastructure so people can't just disregard them, so to speak. And this is extremely, extremely important because we can't just say, oh, well, China, we don't have to worry about them. They're not actually going to be an issue in the future. We can just keep on rolling. No big deal. We'll just keep trading with them. We'll keep giving them money. And when you say that to me, I'm sitting here, as I've talked about before, I'm not much of a hawk on most things except for China. We've done a lot of China coverage throughout the course of this channel. We will continue to do a lot of China coverage throughout the course of this channel, because they are the next threat to the US-based hegemony throughout the world. And when I say threat, I don't mean direct enemy, oh, we have to destroy any threats. But if we don't tread carefully, if we don't just take them seriously, if we pretend as though that they can be dismissed and that buying from them and their state-owned corporations and not at least addressing the economic situation that we're in with them, then it is going to be to our detriment. And the reason that I always go here is, do you want to go to war with a country that is basically supplying 50% of an entire industry? And that's not an exact number, but my point being, they have that kind of reach, that kind of octopus, squid arms, whatever you want to call it, going out into the world and being in a lot of crucial industries. And do you want to go to war with them? No, that's a natural deterrence. Great. Okay, some people, myself included, we don't want to go to war in general. We want to try to not lose American lives. We don't want to lose Chinese lives. We want human beings to prosper. Great. But then if you are dissuaded and not willing to go to war and at least use some sort of enforcement mechanisms that could get you closer to that, but it could also de-escalate, then guess what? The country that has all that production capacity, that is providing all of those key resources and all of those key industries, they have the leverage in the upper hand. They have the advantage. And when it comes to America on the world stage, it is not as to pretend that everything has to go our way, but I'm going to think about my nation first. And if China is going to use that leverage to block us or lock us out of key markets, think here Indonesia. China has done a very, very good job in building its relationships with Indonesia, going to be one of the most populous nations in a few years. They have a lot of raw materials. They are building refineries there as well. So they've done a good job of locking us out of that market for the most part. A lot of foreign investment comes from China, not the United States. That is, I'm not saying all economics is a zero-sum game, but that is a limiting factor for us. And then you could say, hey, well, why wouldn't we go to Argentina? We could, create jobs there. We could make an enterprise there. We could get the lithium deposits that are absolutely massive. Guess who is in our backyard eating our lunch there too? China. So to pretend as though that these are completely isolated systems, that they're not going to have some effect, that this leverage that they have won't be used against us and limit our economic potential going into the future, therefore limiting our ability to expand, therefore increasing our GDP, therefore raising the cost of living for everybody in our nation and making sure that everybody prospers, all of these things are connected to some degree, is naive if we don't acknowledge the reality here. So with this article from the Wall Street Journal, they delve into some of these things and the really important resources that are part of the EV revolution, part of this green energy push, that China has either control over production or they have control over refining. Quote, China is not just standing still watching for us, the U.S., to catch up, said Morgan Blazin, director of Payne Institute at the Colorado School of Mines. Quote, they are making investments on the top of their already massive investments in all aspects of the critical material supply chain. Take nickel, which is needed for electronic vehicle batteries. Chinese processing plants that dot the Indonesian archipelago are pumping out vast quantities of mineral from new and expanding facilities, jolting the market. Meanwhile, Switzerland-based giant Glencern is suspending operation at its nickel plant in New Caledonia, a French territory, concluding that it can't survive despite offers from financial help from Paris. So you're saying here, okay, we've already established that they are building up the infrastructure, but what's the repercussions of this? What is happening because they have all this infrastructure built up in Indonesia? Well, because they are already able to produce everything, they are already able to say, okay, hey, Indonesia, we're going to import a little bit more of our nickel and lithium that we're getting from other places around the world. We're going to take some of your resources as well. But since we're helping you build refineries there, let's actually ship some of these materials to you guys. It's a great economic plan for both of us. And then Indonesia says, okay, great, let's do it. We want jobs for our people. And as they are refining, they can't just always keep these stores in-house, because you can, to some degree. There's no doubt that they could keep it in a giant storage shed and not flood the market and keep the prices where they are. But that is very cost inefficient if you are just storing up everything that you're making. So they're saying, hey, well, we need to get some of these minerals that are refined out into the market. And in doing so, they are actually plummeting the price. And that's great for anyone who already has the economies of scale, who can produce at that level and say, okay, well, yeah, no, I can compete. If it used to be $1, I can compete at 75 cents. I already have all the refineries in place. I have those good connections with companies that have been around for a while, or maybe there's a state connection there. Maybe there's another Indonesian. So I'll give an example, like in the United States, maybe there are 2 or 3 refining companies in the United States, and there's maybe 4 or 5 mineral deposit companies that go in and actually extract some of the minerals, and they've built up good connections. They have already streamlined some of their processes, and the U.S. government also decided, hey, we're going to provide a subsidy for the transport of minerals from states that are X and give them to the refineries in states that are Y. And there are certain benefits that the U.S. government could give to them. Whether or not you like it, whether or not you think it's a good way to go about free market economics, it is something that actually happens. And it is exactly the case in China, where a lot of these mineral companies are owned by China. A lot of these refineries have investment from China or are outright owned by Chinese companies. So they're able to give each other advantageous deals. And also, they've built up the capacity over these last few years so that the economies of scale make it that much easier to produce these minerals very cheaply and then be able to sell them cheaply and still make a profit. But then guess what happens to everybody else that's trying to get into the market? They can't keep up and they don't have the economies of scale. So maybe if it was at that dollar price point that I mentioned, they could maybe survive a price drop to 90 cents because their refineries are putting them out. Their supply chain is pretty, streamlined. They have some good connections, but they don't have the massive refineries where you can do larger batches, therefore cutting the cost per batch and cutting the amount of labor hours per batch. And also, maybe that refinery is in the United States, like I was talking about, versus in a country like Indonesia or like China. And why do you think China is also doing it in Indonesia rather than its home base for some of these? Because the Chinese economy has been booming. They have been having higher standards of living. Therefore, people expect higher wages for manual labor. So if you go to a country that does not have those same standards of living, you can get cheaper labor as well. All of these things are factors, and it allows them to produce these materials a lot cheaper, therefore flood the market and undercut anybody who's trying to build up the capacity. Now, you may say that this is just free market economics, and you can say, hey, they're trying to take their advantage and they're trying to run with it. They're trying to make sure that their competition can't get out there. They are the John D. Rockefeller of nickel and lithium. Oh yeah, they are going to be out there. They're going to be undercutting everybody else, and they are going to get the job done and make their money, which is a fair point. Then again, this could also be part of a strategic effort. Let's be clear. It is very hard to find specific evidence saying that Chinese officials are doing this in order to undercut other countries. I don't have that sort of information here. But to pretend as though that wouldn't be the case, it would be looking at the tariffs that Biden's putting in place or the CHIPS Act that Biden signed into law and saying, well, hey, there's no direct communications that they're trying to undercut China here, or that they're trying to specifically target these sort of regions and these sort of resources in order to affect change in the environment and block out other competitors that are Chinese in origin. It would be extremely naive to genuinely believe that, especially when a lot of these companies have Chinese-backed investment, but also government involvement directly in their companies. And this is something that I've talked about multiple times, which is there really a private company in China? Is there really a company that is not in some way, shape, or form at least not controlled, but at least has some sort of influence? Maybe it's a board member who is from the Chinese government. Maybe it is just a liaison who talks directly with government regulators, and they come back with saying, well, hey, they were really worried about this process, and they said that they might regulate it. And guess what? That's enough for some companies to be like, okay, yeah, we don't want the government to come in here and regulate it. We're gonna comply, and that's why we have those government liaison officers anyway. So we know that the Chinese government has a lot of fingers in lots of pies across the Chinese economy, and this is just another one of them. Quote, it's just the way China does things. They've tended to build more capacity, whether it's in aluminum or cement or nickel, said William Adams, head of base metals research for Fast Markets. Chinese companies all gun for market share, and the consequences for that is you get oversupply. Western officials, too, are sounding the alarm. In response to the question last month about China's dominance in nickel, Canadian Deputy Prime Minister Christina Freeland said the market has been flooded, making business in free market democracies uneconomic. It, quote, and this is the quote I really think is important, and she's also saying some things without the 100% proof, but I think she's right. Quote, it is our belief that behavior can be intentional, can be happening with the purpose of driving companies in our country and those of our allies out of business, she said. Freeland did not provide further details or any evidence for the claim. And that I'm not saying that it is 100% verified, but it very well could be intentional. And if it is intentional, that is economic warfare, essentially. That is going over to if you're in a mafia and you have a rival mafia in town and you guys are the best hitmen around. This is like going over to the rival hitman in the other mafia and capping his knees real quick and saying, okay, hey, yeah. We didn't actually, interfere with the process itself. We didn't actually completely cut it off, and we didn't, make it so that this business is totally inoperable. We just, hurt one of the main key elements. We took out the guy who actually does the job, or at least the best guy, and we're going to lower our prices because of it. Yes, I understand that analogy actually does fall apart a little bit, but imagine this is a way of kneecapping these different companies all across the world who are not at the level of China yet. And this is a policy, and you hear it here, and maybe it's not said directly, but it is kind of a roundabout way. It is just the way China does things. They've tended to build more capacity and gain market share, is what he eventually gets down to. And that is exactly what happens when they are subsidized by the Chinese government. That is the Chinese government's intentional plan, to become so entangled in world markets that they can't be removed, to have such a large market share that they can outstrip any other company that would participate in that market. And a lot of these companies can do that directly because of the subsidization and the tax benefits and breaks they get within their own country, and even the policy of the Chinese government to increase their presence with the Belt and Road in other developing economies, and directly saying in these contracts that, okay, yeah, we'll help build a dam for you in XYZ country, but we're going to have to bring in our Chinese companies to do it. It's going to be mostly Chinese labor. We'll provide some jobs for you, but a lot of it is going to be our Chinese contractors. And these are beneficial geostrategical policies that are meant to enforce, or at least, I don't want to say vilify, but cement the Chinese businesses' presence around the world and their presence in these markets. So we need to take this seriously. We need to seriously ask the questions. One, are those tariffs actually going to do anything? I don't know. I mean, Biden is genuinely trying to take on the issue. He's trying to put on these tariffs to make it harder or more expensive to buy Chinese aluminum, steel, and other EV-related materials. And I understand the thought process. Hey, we're going to make it more expensive to buy those materials, and therefore, in order to get those things made here in America, it's actually going to be comparable. So people aren't going to go into the free market and say, oh, well, hey, China's just producing it for a little bit cheaper, we'll get it there. It's trying to tip the scales a little bit and make it even for American companies. But guess what? A lot of the end consumer products that are not getting tariffed are still using Chinese materials on steel and things like that, which therefore are still going to be more expensive. So it's going to be more expensive to get the EV evolution, even though he's trying to level the play field for the production of those things. It is the question of looking at the long term versus the short term. And I know I made an appeal to us at the very beginning to look at the long term and ask the question whether or not we should continue down this path or we should hold off until our capacity is up. And this policy works if you're trying to build the capacity and you're okay with not buying any of those other products that would use the Chinese steel and other manufactured lithium and things like that for a while, because then you're not actually paying high prices for them and still giving them the money, and you're allowing these other companies to develop, even though, in a free market situation, I would say that you're actually overly subsidizing them and they're going to fail when that money from the government is gone. But, then again, it's worked for China, so obviously it could work for us. This is a very sarcastic statement. But I think his approach would be even better if you put up those tariffs and you said, hey, and let's be clear, I don't like tariffs. I do not enjoy this sort of tariffs. I would love to just be able to beat the Chinese government in a free market scenario. So you put up these tariffs, and we're going to analyze what would work. You put up these tariffs, and then you stop buying that green technology until the infrastructure is such that we can buy all from ourselves, or at least from our allies. We can refine by ourselves. There's a new refinery that they're opening in Minnesota, which the article talks about. So once that capacity is there and we no longer have to give money to any Chinese company or any company that uses Chinese materials on the end consumer area, meaning your final solar panels or your battery packs or things like that, then you could take that approach. And in the meantime, you would have to use more fossil fuels, maybe use some hydrogen fuel, start adapting in that direction, rely on places like Tesla that make their own batteries. Maybe they can, and then again, they probably source a lot of their lithium from the Chinese government as well. We know that's a part of the strategic plan that Musk had going into China and having a factory there, is building some connections with some of the largest lithium suppliers. He did try to have an independent process. There's no doubt about that. That's why he built the Gigafactory. But all of these things are still interconnected. So to pretend as though we're going to be able to completely cut them off and say, no, tariffs, we're going to make it hard, and then keep on going in this green direction and not give them money is crazy. Now, if we pull back from the green direction until we're at the point where we're fully able to do it on our own, which is going to take a long, long time, that wouldn't appease the environmentalist, but it's something we need to at least consider. We would have to up some of our traditional fossil fuel, maybe natural gas production, and do that for a while until we don't have to take on this battle. And the ironic thing is, a lot of these plants that are refining, a lot of the places that are providing the energy in China and in Indonesia, they are coal power plants. They are creating these green technologies with less than green technology and then selling it back to us at a premium and saying, oh, yeah, have fun with your green technology. We just made it 10 times cheaper over here in our coal power plant. But hey, that's just me. I'm not being cynical whatsoever. So let's jump to our second article that comes from Slate. And this is something that Biden needs to address, which is the youth vote going away. They are not staying with Mr. Joe Biden. They do not love him. And the question then becomes, okay, hey, if he's going to lose the youth vote and it is not retrievable, where does he go in order to shift the outcome of the election? And what Slate relies on a lot here is the Swing-O-Matic. It is a tool provided by 538, the polling company, and I have played with it. I would go play with it for a little bit, because genuinely, even if you don't necessarily care about what specific demographic is going to show up where, it's just very interesting to see how these small shifts in the turnout of a particular group, the amount of support within that group, the breakdown between parties within certain groups, that can actually affect the election and affect our electoral system. It is very, very interesting. Now, some people who don't like the electoral system will say, yeah, no, it is interesting. It's freaking crazy. Hey, can we just have mass voting? Can we just have a plain old democracy where we just have the popular vote? And we're not going to get into that here today because I've done episodes on that previously. I can't remember which numbers they are, so go have a gander. Just watch a whole bunch of them down there. But my point being that we do have an electoral system, so tools like this that allow you to understand how certain shifts in certain areas, whether that be the Midwest, the East Coast, youth vote, turnout among the older population, these sort of things. If you want to check out that tool, it's the Swing-O-Matic at 538. So with that out of the way, let's jump into Slate, which uses this tool, and they talk about it a little bit more. Quote, as the already unbearable 2024 election drifts towards its conclusion, breath by raspy breath. I love that, by the way, from the author. Quote, President Joe Biden is standing... President Joe Biden's standing has barely improved from 2 months ago. The 538 polling average shows Biden gaining just 1.3 points on former President Donald Trump since the beginning of March. And that is, that's tiny. That's, if Donald Trump was here, he would say, that's tiny. That's small stuff. It's like small hands, Rubio. It doesn't measure up. And I know, my Trump impression has not gotten any better over the years. But if you have made it to this point, then you probably don't really care. So thank you for making it to this point. But it really exposes the problems that is on Joe Biden's tail. He's looking here and saying, wow, okay, even in these critical swing states, I'm not doing as well. Now, some people are saying the Biden camp has resigned to just ignoring the polls. Other people say that the Democrats are being too over the top. And whether or not, whenever the Times Santa poll comes out, they go a little bit crazy. And whether you believe any of those particularly, I don't really care. I'll be honest. I think the people that are talking about, hey, looking at trends, I agree with them a little bit more, because trends that show up across polls and are verified across polls are more important than raw numbers. Because guess what? If one poll shows Biden has 60% support among young people and another one shows that he has 55, but both of them in the next poll that come out say that support went down by 3%, that trend can be independently verified even though the numbers are different. And that is something, or I say independently verified, it can at least provide some hints that there's something else going on there. Or the inverse could happen if they both raise around the same percent, even if the numbers are different. Because guess what? Polling makeup is going to be different with every single person. But the trends among those groups could still be present. Then again, if there's an error in the polling population, there could still be an error in the trends. I do understand that. I'm not trying to pretend like it's 100% one way or the other. But that is why 538 made things like the swing-o-matic. This is so that they can go in, they can alter the parameters by which we are examining what will happen and get a new outcome. And this is what really needs to be looked at when going through the youth vote numbers. Quote, to help make sense of the Barrage data, 538 recently debuted a tool that they call the swing-o-matic, which allows you to futz around with candidate support and turnout rates for a variety of demographic subgroups that pollsters believe are crucial to the party coalition. Chillingly, a mere 5-point drop in support for 18 to 29-year-olds, holding everything else constant from 2022, including youth turnout, is enough to torpedo Biden's campaign. Which is, that is insane. Then again, we've known that the youth contingent was something that Biden deeply cares about. We have seen the pivot on certain issues because they are ones that the younger voters care about deeply. We've seen this actively throughout his presidency. We know that student debt is, I don't want to say it's a gift to them, but it's definitely an issue that resonates more with these younger voters. So we know that he's at least conscious of this. But how does he make up for it? Quote, that gap reached a high of more than 35 points in 2000 and more than 26 points in the oldest eligible cohort, showing up in less than a third of the 18 to 24-year-olds voting. In 2022, 18 to 24-year-olds had the highest turnout rate since 1972. So I kind of jumped in the middle of a sentence there, so let me actually break down what they're saying. They're saying that, one, 2020's election had a really, really high youth turnout, and which is abnormal. And normally these are offset by the older contingent, which is anybody above 50 years old, which have a higher turnout, a turnout higher by 35%. About 35% higher than the youth turnout normally. And in 2000, it was about 67% is what they were getting at. So what needs to change in that cohort? What does Biden need to gain in that older group that we know turns out more reliably? It tends to be only 1 or 2 points. Quote, the tool's 2020 baseline is set at 11-point margin for Republicans among voters 65 and older. That's yet another estimate that's quite different from the 2020 results. But if we drop that margin slightly, just slightly, to 9 points, Biden can withstand a 5-point drop in support and turnout. Not just 5 points lost in support, but same turnout, but 5 points lost in turnout and support among the young voters. Take it down to 6 points so they're saying instead of the Republicans leading this older demographic, 65 and up, by 11 points, say it's 6 points. Quote, Biden still wins with a 10% erosion in the youth margin, a 9-point drop in the youth voter turnout, which I feel like that's something that is possible. A lot of people are discontent, and a lot of people don't want Biden again, but they're also sitting here like, I don't want Trump either. There are a lot of people who grew up in my generation who are just politically apathetic because of the craziness, and the people that are really passionate, like me, or like you, if you've listened to this point, like you and you're in my age group, we are rare. We are probably political junkies, or we're just genuinely interested people who are engaged enough to already have some sort of opinion and to have some fundamental principles that they're willing to stand by and have thought about their political philosophy a little bit more than in passing. So what Biden really needs to do is switch that older voters onto him. And we have seen some shifts in polls. We've seen some shifts in some of the largest polls of the older voters. Some people say this is because Biden's worried about medication costs. He's been trying to shore up some Medicare benefits, things like this. And these are issues that resonate, just like there's issues about the Israel-Gaza going-ons that resonate with the youth voters, the Medicare and health insurance and benefits that older people live off. All of these issues resonate with older voters. So he could have a path forward. And to dismiss him based on the current numbers, whether you're a Democrat, you running in fear, or you're a Republican saying, oh, hey, it's basically over, never do that. First off, the polls are so far away. Second off, the trends aren't even lining up in one particular direction or another, besides the trend that is the New York Times saying Trump is going to win after they release some of their polls and getting everybody in a frenzy. But statistically, the trends have not completely codified or solidified yet. And we have seen upticks in older people's support for Biden. I've seen it in my personal life. There are people in my personal life who I thought would never say anything nice about Biden. At least they didn't in the past. But now that, the coverage has changed, they see some of the benefits that his administration has brought. And also there's just more bad orange man. Their opinions have changed. I've seen it personally, which I did not see coming. So my point being, don't count Biden out. Not yet. He is speaking to his contingency. Old people. He is speaking to his constituency is what I meant to say. Sorry, I sounded like Joe Biden there, constantly messing things up. He is speaking to his constituency of people who are born around the same age as him and have very similar life experiences. And maybe older people say, hey, that is Scranton Joe. I understand where he's coming from. I understand his life story. When he talks about the Jiffy Mart or that ice cream store, that was really popular. It went out of business when I was, getting into my 20s, but hey, it was really popular when I was growing up. Sorry, I'm not trying to take a slight at older people. Some of the most influential, kind-hearted people in my life are on the older end of the spectrum, but that doesn't mean I'm pointing out anything wrong when I say that Joe Biden is speaking to that constituency, and that's maybe why we're also seeing a little bit of extra support for him among that group. So let's jump to our final article. It's going to be a very, very quick one just because I find it hilarious. So the president of Iran, and okay, so I say hilarious. I need to make sure I preface this. The president of Iran passed away in a flying helicopter that went down in bad conditions, and the U.S. State Department issued a condolence for him. Quote, but within hours of confirmation that Mr. Raisi, who had served for 3 years as Iran's president, was killed in a weekend helicopter crash, the U.S. State Department announced its official condolences for his sudden death. Quote, a terse statement issued on Monday under the name of the State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller betrayed no grief for the Iranian leader, who frequently railed at the United States and is believed to have at least condoned attacks on American troops in Iranian backed proxy forces in Iraq and Syria. So we're not out there saying, hey, we're praying for you. We're giving you our best wishes. We are sending out a State Department gentleman, the spokesperson, and saying, you have our condolences. Okay, I get it. We're trying to do a little front thing. We're trying to pretend like we really care. We don't. We care geostrategically, but when it comes to this terrible, terrible person who was called a butcher, it's literally one of his many nicknames. No, we don't. We don't really care. I'm going to be honest. We're probably happy that he's gone. And to put up a front like, oh yeah, you have our condolences, I don't know why we did it. Maybe it's just to be nice. Maybe it is just to maybe put us on a new foot going forward when the new president comes in. Sure. But it just made me giggle. I was like, guys, come on. Like, really? Do we really have to do this? Just say that there is an example within the article that talks about Eisenhower talking to the nation of the USSR, not talking about Stalin when Stalin died. He didn't talk about Stalin's character. He didn't say, we condone, we're saying, hey, we're with the entire USSR nation. We're here. We will be praying for you. You people are strong. Say that about the Iranian people. There's a fomenting pressure within the populace in order to affect change. And if these elections were actually to be legitimate, they probably would affect a lot of change. So why don't we do that rather than saying we are giving condolences to somebody we don't genuinely care about? But hey, whatever. I'm not a geostrategic expert. Somebody will probably comment and say, Alex, no, we have to do this just to be nice. And I'm going to sit here and be like, hey, well, maybe we shouldn't be nice to these sort of people. Maybe we just have a fundamental difference in view. So with all that said, we're going to jump on to something a little bit more calming, a little bit more fun. And this is our daily delight. This one comes from thestate.com with the headline, Wild Horses Family Reveals Adorable New Member on Outer Banks Beach. And I didn't know that the Outer Banks actually had basically a preserve, or they had these wild horses that they attempt to make sure that nobody goes near. They don't feed them any food. I had no idea about this. And it was really, really cute to see, or at least hear about this story. There's a link to the Facebook page where they're posting about it. And if you want to see any of the cute photos or videos, or read this article as well to learn about the new horse that's joined the family in the Outer Banks, or you want to read any of today's articles, there'll be a link in the description below that like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Google Podcast, as well as Podvine, and the Twitter handle @YourDailyFlip, where I post a Twitter tirade every Tuesday and Thursday. So with all that said, there is only one more thing to say. Stay safe. Don't die.